name is Jackie Lamb, and I am the YouTube director for her campus at American University. And I am so excited to be interviewing one of HCAU's very own writers, Grace Hasson. In July of 2020, Grace published her debut book, Into the Orange Grove, a collection of poetry, which is available on Amazon. So, Grace, I was wondering if first, before we get started on questions, if there is a portion of the book, whether it's half a poem or a full poem that you would like to share with us.
So I would like to share a piece of my poem, Michelangelo Painting the Sistine Ceiling. The poem reflects on writer's block and overcoming writer's block, but from the perspective of Michelangelo. So I really liked that. So I'm going to read the last stanza, which
Great.
reads, I won't stop. My brush makes heaven come down. God stays on the ceiling. I think he too loves the taste of earth.
Beautiful. Thank you, Grace. And so you gave us a bit of a hint there with what your book is about, but I was wondering, how would you describe it in about two or three sentences? What story your book tells through poetry?
I would say the book mostly tells about togetherness and connection between people. It also tells about how it's okay to not be okay. And if you are struggling with mental illness, it's okay to feel that way and it's okay to ask for help. And finally, it's about freedom to express oneself through me expressing myself, and creativity to the highest degree one can reach. I really wanted to write something that was fantastical, but also personal, but also somewhat about religion and somewhat have mythology, and really just the idea of any idea you have is a good one. Just take all of them and write something that involves all of them. Why not?
Great. And so you touched on like the themes and key concepts you explore in your collection of poetry. I think you briefly mentioned this, but what what was something that inspired you to write this collection of poetry?
So I was already writing the book without knowing it because I took a poetry class at AU, and I wrote for that class and I started compiling. I've always been writing poetry since I was about 13, and it started to compile more. I joined a class for book writing, and I was going back and forth between writing a fiction novel or doing poetry. And I already had so many poems that there was no reason not to go that way. And since I really wanted to write something fantastical, I realized that I could actually do both. I could do fantasy and poetry, and the opportunity was there. And the book writing class that I took takes a year to write a book, and for me, writing a book in a year, it makes more sense to do poetry.
Interesting. Okay. So when you were starting with the poems individually instead of thinking of them as part of a whole an entire collection, would you say there was one poem in particular that really is the the heart of your collection, or would you say that's not true?
So there's 3 sections to the book. There's the, like, opening section that's more about, like, relationships and losing connection between people, and then the second section is more about losing connection with yourself, and the final section is about coming together and, like, reconnecting.
Okay,
And
so
I would
think
say there's definitely points to each of the sections. For me, the first poem that really stood out to me and was like, "This is something," was Dragon Bones. I read that and I wrote it, and that originally was gonna be the title of the book. So that one has a special place in my heart. That's definitely the heart of the second section of the book. It's more of a, darker side of the whole book, but I would say the main part of the book would have to be the title poem, because after I wrote the title poem, Into the Orange Grove, I brought it to my mentor and he was like, "This is it. Like, this is the title. This is the first poem in the book." And I was like, 100% that we're doing that. It has to be that one.
awesome. Okay. What would you say is you mentioned the title of your book, and I remember reading that poem. And when I read your book, I remember thinking that there are a lot of topics that you touch on. You touch on relationships, as you mentioned, you touch on mental health. And I was wondering if you feel that there is your key message that you are trying that you express in this collection?
I think one of the great things about poetry is that everyone gets something different from it. You can have 10 people read a poem and they'll get 10 different answers. I think one of the main things you can take away from the book is that it's okay to not be okay. How important it is to connect with other people. Stuff like that I definitely think most people will get from it, but I also think it's important to lead poetry up for interpretation.
Definitely. And speaking of interpretation, since your book has been available for purchase in these past few months, and many people have been able to read your book and react to it, I'm wondering what is your favorite reader reaction that either you've read online or you heard from a friend or someone you know who read the book? What would you say is your favorite kind of other person takeaway from it?
I can definitely answer that one. My favorite interaction was my friend lent a copy of the book to his roommate, and his roommate locked himself in his room all day reading it, just the entire day, just reading it, and said he cried while reading it, and it was just such an emotional experience that that was all he wanted to do for a long time, just read. And there's no higher compliment than someone feeling it that connection to my book emotionally, and also to be that enwrapped in the story.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. So speaking of emotions and how books are so vital to or such an integral part to our really our humanity is what would you say who would you say are the poets or other fiction writers or just writers in general that inspired you to publish and write your first novel or collection of poetry?
The first book and first author I read that I was like, "I want to do this," was Christopher Paolini's Aragon, just the story with the dragon, just loved that. I read that and that's what I wanna do. Poet-wise, I'm a really big fan of Audre Lorde and Mary Oliver, David Keplinger, Sylvia Plath. There's definitely plenty of poets I've read. I definitely lean more towards I'm trying to read more poetry lately, but I think it's really important as a writer, whether you're writing poetry or fiction, it's important to read both.
Oh, definitely. And speaking of kind of learning from other artists, now that you've kind of you're over this hill of you had your first book of poetry published, and I was wondering what advice would you give to someone who wants to write their own book of poetry or even their own book of fiction, but aren't exactly sure how to go about it?
I would say one of the most important things is just to write and write for yourself. Write what you want to write for your own happiness, and that's what matters the most. And I really noticed that the poems that I write, even just practice writing and have that I'm trying to impress people, people don't really have much of a reaction. But the poems I wrote for myself that I felt good writing, that I wanted to write just for my own sake, those are people's favorites. And I think when it really comes to poetry, it really comes down to that honesty. Is that what that's what people are looking for, even subconsciously. And even when you're writing fiction, it has to be your story. You can't write, "Oh, this is gonna sell." You have to write what you wanna write, and that's what will come out the best.
Very, very true. Very true. Well, thank you so much for your time, Grace, and thank you for answering my questions and for sharing your book with us. Anyone who wants to purchase Grace's book, it's Into the Orange Grove, a collection of poetry, which is available on Amazon. Thank you so much, Grace.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. Anytime.